In an article posted on Frontiers in Human Neuroscience by M. Bruce McIver of Stanford University School of Medicine in Palo Alto, California, the topic was on electromagnetic field, EMF, theories of mind-brain integration. He shared that when these mind circuits are active, they produce synchronized synaptic and discharge activity across wide regions of the brain, adding that this synchronized neural activity summates to generate the EMFs we record as electroencephalogram, abbreviated as EEG, and also magnetic encephalography. Those are the MEG signals, noting that these fields extend for relatively long distances because they can be measured through the human skull and scalp. MEG signals are magnetic fields that are a direct result of electrical activity in neurons when groups of neurons fire in synchrony. Much of what this author, U.S. Andersen, is proposing in this book is not new to many of us. And much of what he discussed back in 1961 now is being explained through science. But perhaps the way that the author presents the material will help you in some way make the right connections that will guide you to implement systems to bring you self-mastery, if that is what you're looking for. Also, if you are interested in learning about this author, I do have a small bio in another audio-video book from his book titled 3 Magic Words here in the channel. I'll add the link in the description of this video. Now going back to the magic in the mind. What if mastery of your fate would be as simple as you mastering your reaction to events and condition? In other words, you managing your feelings, your emotions, instead of your emotions controlling you. And by having this mastery, you may have better relationships, whether personal or business, and this interprets itself as success in love and career. As I pondered what the author proposed in reference to self-mastery, I wondered if it could be that turning over your will to a higher power, as referred to some religions, was the same as letting go of the ego. I'm coming to the conclusion that science, philosophy, and religion have different ways of explaining the same thing. I'm just saying. I want to give a warm welcome back to our channel subscribers and a warm hello to all new folks who just found me for the first time. If that is you, please make sure to visit my book playlist so you can grab the first chapter of this fine book we are embarking on. There you will learn about the giant within and to attune yourself to act in accord with the gigantic tides that bring the future. I interpret that as riding the wave of opportunity. The trick is knowing that the tide just rolled in. And too many times, fear and apprehension stop us from jumping on the board to surf the wave. Chapter 1 also discussed the importance on recognizing that growth is inherent in us, but sometimes growth is stunted by our own design, created by our limited perception of established paradigms. And as we begin this journey of self-development, we must embrace the idea that nothing can be accomplished without a fight. The challenge is knowing where to expend that effort. The author suggests that we must start with developing our consciousness. And you're probably asking the same question I asked. How? How do we do that? The answer is simple for us to understand. The challenge is in the process, and you might agree as you get through these pages with me. So how? By giving up the ego and the distractions of the outer world. Yeah, easier said than done. Welcome, I am Daisy, your hostess. That and much more is covered in the first chapter, and I now invite you to come along with me as we navigate through chapter 2. Discovering the secret self. Human personality is immensely complex. A person is far more than a name and certain physical, mental, and emotional characteristics. It is strange that we ever feel we know others at all, when the slightest examination of our own psyche reveals at once that we know scarcely anything about ourselves. We do not even dwell alone in our own bodies, are for the most part a battleground for opposing sides of our nature. And as one assumes command, then another, we present the constantly changing colors of a chameleon. Our many selves. A man engaged in concentrated effort often talks to himself. One part of him sits in judgment on the other, so that he gives vent to little exclamations of exasperation such as, "You can do better than that, Henry, old boy," or "Don't be such a bonehead, you can get it." In this apparent division of the self, one half assumes a nature that appears above reproach, while the other apparently has the personality of a mischievous, recalcitrant child. If you ask Henry which of the two he is, he answers that he is Henry. If you ask him who is talking to Henry, he achieves a look of utter blankness, manages to answer at last that he's only talking to himself. Well, it isn't just a way that Henry has, it's a way that all of us have. We house within us not one nature, but many. Not one self, but a whole myriad of selves superimposed upon each other like endless reflections in opposing mirrors. And not one of these selves is our true self, not even all taken together, but another true being hidden within, timeless and eternal and unchanging. The conflicts and opposition of the many sides of our surface nature are directly responsible for the prevalence of the psychological disorder called schizophrenia. The schizophrenic is disoriented with the world and himself through intense inner conflicts waged by several of his different natures. In extreme cases, one, then the other, takes over, so that he is possessed of several distinct personalities, each as different from the other as night from day. A number of clinical cases of this nature have been studied extensively. One has even been made into a best-selling book, so that by and large people are finally becoming aware of the wavering, mystical being in each of us. It really is. The psychologically sound person is one who takes charge of his own personality, refuses to allow himself to be influenced by the wind, imposes a discipline upon himself predicated upon the goals he wishes to achieve. Yet despite this taking charge, despite the discipline imposed upon the surface nature and inner parts of the psyche, the psychologically sound person must remain subservient to an inner hidden part of his being, that indestructible and bright core within that sustains him and gives him life. If he does not, then a sickness of all his parts aggrandizes his ego, disassociates him from reality, causes him to assume the psychologically functional disorder known as paranoia. His blown-up ego then has shut him off from the supporting and sustaining secret self, and he is heading directly for destruction. Most of the dictation of our modern political systems have been of this type, carrying their countries and themselves to destruction in a blind and headlong rush. Infinity in the finite. It becomes obvious, once we give it close consideration, that man not only is at war with nature, but actually is at war with himself. We are such battlegrounds within that often we cannot contain our turmoil, and our entire psyche becomes permeated with a sickness that makes it of little use to the world or ourselves. whatever the human being is, he is more than a physical body, and the misty shape of his invisible aura is something that cannot be contained within boundaries or assigned categories or weighed or measured or counted. All that we are and can hope to be is mental, is the essence of some gigantic intelligence in the lap of which we nestle and from which we are fed and nurtured as if from subterranean springs. This gigantic intelligence is the secret self of the universe. It is also, paradoxically enough, the secret self of each of us. No amount of rhetoric prevails against disbelief. No argument dissuades the man of faith. Still, the enigma is there. How is it possible that something infinite in size and scope, like a universal mind, can be housed within the tiny, finite body of an individual man? To be infinite is to be one. More than one of anything infinite automatically is not infinite. For anything infinite occupies all the space there is and therefore does not leave room for anything else. Thus anything infinite is exactly the same as anything within it. For all of anything infinite has to be at each particular place at each particular time. Now this may be a pretty hard dose to swallow, but it is perhaps as scientifically sound as the quantum theory of physics. And what it essentially means is this: if there is intelligence behind life, and there is every reason to believe there must be, then all of that intelligence is innate in each creation of that intelligence. Thus, universal mind, or the secret self, is complete and entire within each of us. We have only to discover it for its power and perfection to be ours. But neither the search nor the finding are easy. We are so steeped in our egotism, so insisted within our myriad surface selves, that vision to penetrate the illusion is hard to acquire, is developed only by arduous mental effort and spiritual discipline. Underlying all the turmoil, supporting the contest between the surface selves, giving each life direction and purpose, is the garden from which springs personality, the secret self, a place of calm and certitude within each of us. There is no struggle in the secret self. It knows. Its mere act of perception is an act of creation, for seeing precedes being in this most mental of all places, where thought and idea are always prior to physical act. Behind the wall. Carl Jung has stated that most people confuse self-knowledge with knowledge of their conscious ego personalities, so that anyone with any ego at all takes it for granted that he knows himself. Actually, he knows only the ego and its contents, and seldom has little, if any, knowledge of the vast and shadowy areas of the subconscious from whence all the impulsions and compulsions that form his active life spring. No man is free who feels that this motivation originate in his conscious ego personality. He is moved about in life like a puppet by the subconscious, and all his elaborate reasonings and painful arrivals at conscious perception are made after the fact of his commitment to certain ideas and actions, never before. Between the surface self and the secret self lies an opaque wall, impenetrable to the gaze of the ego and yielding its secrets only to one who has expanded his consciousness beyond the limits of his conscious mind. The materialist who prides himself on never accepting anything but a proven physical fact has merely accepted blindness as a condition of his being, and what he thinks is freedom is simply servitude of the highest degree. Turning one's back on the subconscious does not obliterate it. The individual is sprung into being not by an effort of self, but comes performed by something other than the ego that fronts his conscious during life. The question is, who is the true resident within? The ego that grows from experience, or the life force that animates from the beginning? Reflection leads us inescapably to the conclusion that the true person within is the hidden dweller in all things. That the ego is only a mask donned by this dweller for a moment in some inscrutable play being acted out for its secret delight. The constant search of the psyche of man, as long as it confines itself to the ego and the surface nature, must continue to be fruitless, for it concerns itself with a wraith. To truly know man, his actual nature, origin, purpose, destiny, the deeper regions of consciousness must be probed. These are all subconscient, make up the vast, jumbled, tremendously powerful, even frightening mental area below consciousness. Who knows what things are possible to this area of man's being? Sigmund Freud, having exposed its awesome powers, is reported once to have confessed that he created the dogma of his sexual theory of human behavior because some powerful bulwark of reason was needed against the black flood of occultism that might spring from the subconscious. Yet, it is just that occultism, just that black flood that most needs to be studied, for the secret self lies there. The unuttered part of life. The Ouija board and divining rod are not just parlor games or the tools of crackpots, but are the best of illustrations that within us there is a being enormously different from our surface selves, and which has powers of perception and knowledge vastly greater than our conscious minds. A man with a forked hazel stick can find water beneath the surface of the ground, and this remarkable feat is true not because there is any affinity between the water and the hazel stick, but because there exists in the subconscious of the man a means of perceiving that water underlies a particular piece of ground. The stick turns downward and points out the water because of unconscious muscular reactions on the part of the man. But he will swear it does so of its own volition, and to the degree that the turning down is originated by the secret self and not by his surface self. His claim is true. In any case, the stick turns down, the well is dug, and water is there. The man couldn't even seen the water. The stick couldn't have known it was there. Some other thing, some invisible force was at work. That thing, that force, is the secret self. Thomas Carlyle wrote, "The uttered part of a man's life, let us always repeat, bears to the unuttered, unconscious part a small unknown proportion. He himself never knows it, much less do others." We wend our unheeding, oblivious ways through life, captives of forces we neither understand nor are aware exist, and we labor under the delusion that we are free. This blindness has not been forced upon us because of our relationship to life, nor is it necessary in order to preserve our sanity or individuality as some casuists would have us believe. It is simply an inevitable step in the evolution of mind out of matter, and even now is being transcended by those individuals sufficiently evolved to correctly perceive the secret self and its existence within. Mind seeks to know. Its goal is a constantly increasing awareness. Expanding consciousness is apparent wherever we look, almost as if a mental explosion had taken place in the heart of the universe and now speeds outward in all directions, encompassing everything. Liberation from bondage. The surface mind is not the true mind, is but the barest fractional part of the true mind, and we never know our power and effectuality until we turn away from this troublesome false self and originate thought and action on the deeper planes of our being. Then we become as a power doubled upon itself, have hitched a ride on illimitable energy. Below the surface self and the conscious mind, sustaining and supporting both but remaining infinitely greater than either, is universal subconscious mind, the vast mind that springs into being all living things, that underlies life like a great and infinite ocean of intelligence and energy. This subconscious mind is not just a hodgepodge reservoir of instincts, urges, and long-forgotten memories individual to each man, neither a kind of cell memory or pain and pleasure as some psychologists would have us believe, but encompasses infinitely more, the whole scope of creation, of space and time and knowledge and purpose, and all of this mind is in every person, and no one has a larger share of it than others. And all of it is available to each of us this very moment, is actually the sustaining self of every one of us. Frustration and suffering are the human lot in this stage of evolution because we have separated ourselves from the root source of our power. This has been done as consciousness has evolved into self-consciousness. For the particular stage of self-consciousness at which we have arrived is embryonic, is only self-consciousness in the narrowest sense of the word, delimits itself by the boundaries of the physical senses, and therefore makes of itself a tiny speck in an infinitely large and living universe. It is small wonder that we are blinded to the beginnings and ends of life. So tiny is our newly acquired sense of being. Yet even now it reaches groping and hopeful hands toward an alliance with its greater self. And it is this alliance that will finally liberate it from bondage to the flesh, from the limitation of space and time and matter. The other person in you. All this may sound pretty obscure, even occult, and since the average person today is so grounded and steeped in materialism, there may be those of you who balk at this point and say, "Prove it. Show me evidence of universal subconscious mind." There is evidence aplenty. Various hypnotic techniques are continually exposing layers of the subconscious that indicate that they are not the personal property of the person under hypnosis. For example, Miss Jones may be hypnotized and recall intimate details of a life not her own, so that the unwary researcher will be led to believe that she is recalling a life lived previously. Such evidence is continually offered in support of the reincarnation theses, but no such actual proof ever has been forthcoming. People under hypnosis have spoken languages they neither consciously understood nor ever had heard, described in detail places and times where they had never been and could not have conscious knowledge of, literally performed all manner of clairvoyant feats that indicate the amazing power and scope of the subconscious, and the indisputable evidence is of a single entity only, existing in all persons, but the individual property of none. Someone else lives in your body other than the surface mind, which you have long regarded as yourself. A bigger, finer, more dynamic, more gifted, and powerful person than you ever have imagined yourself to be. But your true self, nevertheless, the real you. Its action and power are behind every thought and move you make. And if your conscious mind is opposed to this real self, then you are torn on the rack of indecision and opposition and meet nothing but frustration and disappointment wherever you turn. But once your conscious mind and surface self are lent as tools to this subconscious self, then of a sudden you are a whole and glorious thing, and you find yourself proceeding along life's pathways with surety and power. Your senior partner. To fully uncover the secret self is no doubt the final goal of evolution. When the inhabiting spirit has fully emerged from matter, then the Godhead will be revealed at last with all its conscious power and infinite realization. The man who joins this irresistible tide is swept onward by unsuspected energies to accomplish feats far beyond his poor mortal self. He has hitched a ride on cosmic power, and his energies and inspirations spill over the boundaries of his surface self and touch all those with whom he associates. He becomes a leader, a doer, a creator, and achieves a kind of omnipotence because he is led in performance by an infallible and irresistible force. You can talk to the secret self. You can go into conference with it, much as you might consult an all-wise and benevolent father or the president of the business that employs you. Once you have the hang of it and come to fully realize beyond any shadow of doubt its potentiality and possibility, then daily conference will be as natural and fitting to your mode of living as the act of breathing. This is the Father that dwells within you, spoken of by Jesus. This is the senior side of your dual personality, the detached one that judges the action and is untouched by it. This is the subconscious mind referred to by psychologists, the mind that never sleeps, thinks when all is still, works with surety and calmness in the midst of the greatest turmoil. This is the talisman that delivers you the hunch that brings you fortune, the idea for your book, painting, or composition, an inner vision, a new path to tread. This is the deep center of your being to which you retreat in meditation and prayer, where joy, serenity, and bliss reign because all is known and truly understood. Haven't you ever contacted it? Set that right at once. As soon as you know the secret self is there, your close relationship to it is assured. For who would turn his back on the source of his redemption from pain and suffering and frustration? An experiment. Take a simple finger ring. Tie it to a thin thread about 12 inches long. Hold the loose end of the thread between your thumb and forefinger. Let the ring dangle. Now tell the secret self that you are going to ask it some questions, that if the ring moves in a small circle, you will understand the answer to be yes, that if it sways back and forth in a linear path, you will understand the answer to be no. Ask the question aloud. Hold the ring and wait. Don't try to stop it from moving, and make no attempt to start it moving. it will move. At first, the movement will be erratic, but soon it will settle into a back and forth or circular motion. Eventually, your questions will be answered instantaneously. Then you will have made a direct contact with the secret self, and you will realize with comprehending awe that someone infinitely aware dwells within you. There is no limit to the power of the secret self. Your whole effort from the moment of your realization of its existence should be to become acquainted with it, to explore its infinite facets, and discover the keys that unlock its powers. Once you begin to guide your life in accordance with its perception and motivation, you will begin to take on an infallibility in works that bodes success in every undertaking, every relationship. You will find that you are accompanied always by a feeling of inner joy and energy and well-being, where before you were always gnawed at by vague anxieties and fears and feelings of lethargy and fatigue. The color of the sky will change. The world will take on a new and meaningful and exciting aspect. You will have placed yourself in tune with the guiding and motivating force of the universe, and it will buoy your spirits heavenward. No task will appear too great, no obstacle insurmountable. Supporter of the worlds. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, "Every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world." And it is this blinding quality of the surface psyche that it cannot see beyond the limits it imposes upon itself, that gives inherent characteristics of weakness and incapability to every mortal man. Even so, the degree is markedly different in the limitations men impose upon themselves. Some men build towers to the sky, challenge nature in her most inaccessible places, make their whole lives a constant attack on mental and physical barriers. Other men accept all the limitations they encounter, live in fear of self-manufactured ogres, cannot challenge, expand, or grow because they are slaves of the tiny surface self and have not glimpsed or understood the giant within them. There is hope for the man who aspires. His place among the gods is assured. But he who hangs back and never dares and never takes action is withering on the tree of life, and all his wishes will not change anything as long as they are not strong enough to prompt him to attack his fear-created walls. Once you have discovered the secret self within, then it becomes a gradual process of turning over your work, your goals and aspirations to it. You cannot build a perfect life on the imperfect foundation of the surface self. It will not support even the flimsiest edifice, will crumble under the slightest pressure. All must be built on the secret self, which already supports the worlds and the universes and will support your life. Be you savant or saint, and without the slightest tremor. A quote by Alexander Pope. Of all the causes that conspire to blind man's erring judgment and misguide the mind, what the weak head with strongest bias rules is pride, the never-failing vice of fools. Facing fear. It is vanity, or pride, if you will, which is the true enemy of the secret self. For with consciousness centered in the surface self, with the vanity that self-centeredness brings, an opaque veil is drawn over all spiritual perception, and a man lives isolated from the wellsprings of his being. He may struggle through life many years in this manner, attacking his problems and pursuing his goals with the persistent energy of an enterprising fly. But eventually, he must be brought up short by the realization that he simply is ineffectual and had best find a new blueprint of thought and action or give up the ghost altogether. One ant alone does not topple a rubber tree plant. Only the concerted effort and teamwork of thousands of ants make this feat possible. And the energy and efforts of one human being is nothing by itself, but is everything when it proceeds from the source of all energy. For then it is attuned to the tides and forces of the cosmos, becomes in a manner an irresistible force, a kind of infallible action. Success stories often are fictions concocted by the human desire to achieve supremacy over circumstance. Most people fit into a kind of equation. They react a certain way when confronted with certain circumstances, and therefore must act a certain way always when confronted with those same circumstances. For example, suppose a man is afraid of groups of people when he is unacquainted with them and expects to circulate amongst them and communicate. If early in life he gives in to his fear and avoids new groups, such behavior becomes a habit and one that he eventually finds impossible to break. Therefore, all through his life, when confronted with a strange social situation, he will avoid it through one pretense or another, simply because he has built up a habit of acceding to fear. He is absolutely predictive in each circumstance of this type, and he is predictive because he is not free, because he is a slave to his fears. He has become an automaton led around by the nose, a victim of circumstances because he is not master of his feelings. He tends to regard circumstance itself as the evil, says people in groups are uninteresting, they bore me. They don't bore him at all. They scare the hell out of him, so much so that he avoids them at all costs, leaves a large blank in a portion of his psyche, and is completely frustrated in this area of his growth. And it is his own fault. He simply cannot bring himself to muster the courage necessary to face his fear. Overcoming weakness. You cannot run away from a weakness. You must sometime fight it out or perish. And if that be so, why not now, or where you stand? Fittingly enough, these lines were penned by a writer bedfast through illness, but he turned that illness into a great victory, eventually recovering his health and giving the world masterpieces of literature. His name? Robert Louis Stevenson. We must not be soft with ourselves, no matter what our goals or position. All things fare best when they are constantly tested by opposition. The sturdiest grass is that which must grow through concrete. The cobbled lawn burns clean away at first exposure to sun or wind. If we have an aching muscle, we must learn to exercise it, not to rest it, and we will find the muscle soon healed. If our psyche is closing us in, cutting us off from the life and growth and expansion, then we must learn to test and use and expand that psyche. If we do not, the psyche will atrophy, cut off completely all normal ties with life. Still, to be human is to be weak, is to be subject to sin and suffering and error, and as long as we live, we never truly overcome any of these. But as long as we live, we must try. For we truly live only when we try. What we finally have to learn is that we cannot expect an ultimate or even a satisfying victory over our infirmities when we meet them one by one, but only when we have found a way of assembling all the same field of battle for one final showdown. What results then must be a complete step forward in our evolution as human beings. For no one is ever defeated who gathers courage to face his assembled weaknesses. How is this possible? Someone may ask. How does one gather all his weaknesses in one spot and overcome them? It is not simple or even apparent. In isolated areas, yes. If you have a tendency to be afraid of new situations, then you can build up confidence about them by forcing yourself to enter into them. Sooner or later, you are bound to meet each new situation calmly, if not eagerly, for the general condition of newness has become familiar. This exercise of willpower, however, while it will tend to give you courage in every aspect of your life simply because you have met fear in one area and defeated it, nevertheless will not overcome a tendency to be lazy, for example, or untruthful, or disloyal, or even to eat too much. As a matter of fact, it can readily be seen that his helter-skelter treatment of the unwhole psyche is much like a man trying to plug a series of leaks in a dike with his fingers. Eventually, all 10 fingers will be occupied, and still the new leak comes. The universal author. What is needed is a new approach to the psyche, one that treats it as a single thing and not as a group of aberrations or incomplete perceptions, and the approach which gives 100% cures in 100% of cases is one in which the individual comes to know and be aware of his secret self. Each of us faces life with an undeveloped psyche. It is undeveloped because it is less than whole, because it is only a partial manifestation of something greater than itself. Only insofar as it approaches awareness of this greater self does it approximate wholeness or self-sufficiency. That sense of self, which we use in our daily rounds of effort, is useful only insofar as it is larger than the task we undertake. It is perfectly up to peeling potatoes, for instance, but when something large is asked of it, then it may cower in the corner. Bridges are built by the secret self and not by the surface ego of man. Towers and highways and planes and automobiles and television are wrought by the secret self. All books are written by the same author. All pictures painted by the same artist. All music written by the same composer. The ego of the individual is simply not up to such task, and as long as a man lives entrapped in bondage to his surface self, then his efforts can only be crowned by such puny results as fit his ego. Only when he tears himself away, divorces himself from vanity and conceit and ego and surface self, can he at last perceive the true dimensions of the being that dwells within him. Then he knows his true self. Then he turns his life over to it. And then his efforts take on a grandeur and purpose that are bound to achieve noble and vigorous ends. For the power that engrosses him proceeds from outside him and carries him along on its surging tides, and is greater than he in every way. Any man or woman whose life is aimed at creative effort is bound to discover the secret self sooner or later. No one can closet himself in the nebulous realm of the mental and spiritual without early coming to know that there dwells within him a mental being of enormous dimension and power, contact with which has the power to ennoble and illumine each moment. The author seeks his muse with all his heart. The painter pauses with raised brush, awaiting inspiration. We are moved from within toward each aspiration, provided it is loftier than the limitations of the surface self. And so the world belongs to those who aspire, who dare, who try. For all aspiration is only effort against the prison of the surface self, and all such effort is the alchemy by which the common clay of our little egos is transmuted into something transcendental and precious. An artist finds his talent. A number of years ago, there lived in a poor section of a large city a man who had given up the years of his youth to perfect his art. He lived meagerly on what few pennies he could earn making charcoal sketches in waterfront bars, and he spent every moment he could spare in front of his easel. His painted ships, every conceivable type and kind, at sea, becalmed and in storm, in port, loading and unloading, ships under sail, ships under stream, sleek yachts, wallowing freighters, men o' war. He loved the sea and he loved to paint, and by the amount of time he had spent at each, he should have mastered his art very well, but he hadn't. Somehow it escaped him. His paintings were not amateurish. They exhibited the hand of a craftsman, yet they always seemed clichés, as if they were saying something that had been said 1,000 times before. People would look at them and even comment that they had seen them before. They hadn't, of course. The paintings just contrived to look like others that had been done. The painter realized this fact only too well. His work was intensely dissatisfying to him. He often would relate that when he first was struck with an idea for a new subject, he would be deeply elated and would set to work with a vengeance. Then, as the work progressed under his hand, he gradually would come to see that it was not a thing of inspiration at all, but wooden, Pat said before, a reproduction, and even before the work was finished, he would be gripped by a depression so intense that he scarcely could finish. Still, he drove himself unremittingly. He felt a talent was within him, and he was determined to get it out. Once, in a rage at himself, he burned all the paintings in his studio, nearly setting fire to the building. Another time, he was so furious at his hand for its clumsiness that he badly lacerated his fingers, intent on cutting them off. All this, of course, would indicate that our friend was not psychologically stable, but perhaps it was simply that his provocation was great. So enormous was the creative urge that constantly goaded him. Like most of the great lessons that life teaches, his enlightenment came dear. When war broke out, he had just finished a period of deep dissatisfaction with his painting. Disgustedly, he decided to turn his back on it forever. He shipped out as a merchant seaman aboard a freighter bound for Murmansk. The convoy was attacked by German planes and submarines as it skirted the Norwegian coast. Our painter's ship was sunk, and he wound up in a lifeboat on the frigid and stormy Arctic Ocean. For days and nights they drifted, fighting the freezing cold, trying to stay alive. At one juncture the skies cleared long enough for them to be sighted by German planes, and they were bombed and strafed. 5 men were killed, 3 others seriously wounded, dying that night. A day later, 2 more died from exposure. Finally, there were left in the boat only the painter and the ship's purser, an elderly and apparently frail man who surprisingly still survived. "It's no use," said the painter at length. "There's no hope for us, and we might as well slip over the side right now and be done with it." "That's not for us to decide," said the purser. "Who then?" asked the painter. The purser sat calmly, and his eyes were kind. Do we decide to be born? He asked. Do we decide our nationality, our race, our heritage? Someone or something else does, I think. Get yourself quiet and listen. Perhaps you will hear a voice speak within you. Then you will learn whether you are to live or die. The end seemed near. Surely it was useless to struggle further. For the first time in his life, the painter was able to give over direction of his destiny to something other than his ego. The bitter cold of approaching night descended on them. Just before dusk, a British seaplane swooped out of the fog with a roar, saw them, landed on the sea, took them aboard. They were in a London hospital that night. After some weeks of convalescence, our painter once again tried his hand at his easel. What emerged from the canvas startled him. It was as if a hand other than his own guided the brush, chose the colors, as though a mind other than his own envisaged the scene. Viewing the complete painting, he felt a surge of joy. This was the talent he had fought to bring forth, and now it was flowing. In rapid succession, he completed 6 paintings, packed them off to a London art dealer, where they were received with open arms. They were instantaneous success, launched him on a long and remarkable career. Years later, he was asked about his early period of struggle and how his talent happened to mature. It didn't mature, he answered. It was there all the time. I just never could bring it out because I thought it belonged to me. As soon as I was able to see that it belonged to a being greater than me, it emerged of its own accord and used me. Where before I had been trying vainly to use it. Mystical, yes, a kind of cosmic perception by the artist of his muse, but a far greater secret is hidden here. Our painter stumbled upon the psychological relationship of ego to secret self that brooks no failure, that inevitably leads to success, for it is a relationship in which all thought and actions proceed out of a universal intelligence and omnipotent power that makes each work absolutely effective. Fall from grace. Our consciousness is anchored falsely in our surface selves, and it is this delusion that is our fall from grace. For by it we do not know who we truly are and fancy ourselves as tiny, isolated selves in a vast and overwhelming universe. The gradual opening and unfolding of consciousness to that point where the vistas within our psyche are revealed is the goal of evolution itself. As life and intelligence and being manifest out of matter, eventually control and dominate matter. As long as we remain chained to the illusion of the surface self, we are but puppets of sensation, reacting this way or that way to every situation that confronts us. Little more than absolutely predictive ciphers in an equation aimed at producing the free-thinking, omnipotent man. Yet this condition of freedom and omnipotence needs only perception, for without doubt, the mere act of perceiving the secret self is akin to becoming one with the secret self. How then shall we see? How shall our eyes be opened? Perhaps the most important step in discerning the secret self is disillusionment with the effectiveness of the surface self. For how is it possible to see when we still rejoice in our blindness? So it is that spiritual awareness, psychic enlightenment, seldom come to one in youth. For youth is preoccupied with the senses, pursues all manner of sensual inamorata, and is for the most part completely oblivious of the prison which the senses have erected. Passing years bring the disappointments the frustrations and inadequacies that cause the seeking soul to cast about within psychic realms for a new foundation on which to erect a more reliable and effective sense of self. When this comes, eventual enlightenment is assured, for no one seeks but he finds, knocks but the door is opened. The mere act of turning away from the senses and the surface self seems sufficient. The veil is removed, the blinder disintegrated, and an event in psychic life that was brought about by suffering and frustration and disillusionment turns out to be the greatest of blessings in disguise. A new world is revealed. The death of the surface self actually turns out to be a new birth. Resignation of the senses from control of the persons turns out to be a seizing of the reins of the life by a new and dominant and effective force. When the inner eye of the soul is opened, there descends upon the whole being a unity of parts and force, a vitality and serenity that remake that life completely, that lend magic and grandeur to everything that is touched or taken into consciousness. A quote by Alexander Pope: "Who sees with equal eye, as God of all, a hero perish or a sparrow fall, atoms or systems into ruin hurtled, and now a bubble burst, and now a world." End of quote. Path to illumination. While it is true that perception of the indwelling secret self ordinarily comes to harassed mortals only after much suffering and disillusionment, nevertheless there is a path by which suffering may be avoided in the main, provided that first the soul is dedicated and sincere in its desire to make the discovery. The secret self is never discovered alone within, but at the same time is discovered in all places, in all beings, and is found to be the same in all. Different forms of life are merely disguises donned for the moment by the single self that underlies all. That truly is all. A play in which for the moment the divine is hidden, in which for that moment it actually has become in entirety each of the things it has become. All the power and effectiveness of the Supreme is within you, is yours to use, and is also in everyone and everything else, existing there behind the curtain of ego consciousness, waiting to be discovered. Therefore, there is a tremendous underlying equality to all things under the sun. Each is sprung from the same substance and has inherent within it the same omnipotent being. And we are not each of us different and individual and separate, except insofar as we are incomplete. To be complete is to be the secret self, whole and entire, without reservation or error. The most painless path to illumination, to perception of the secret self, is thus to arrive at a desire to know the truth that lies behind the surface facade of the senses, and to seek this truth not only within but without, in every person you meet as well as in yourself. Once this sense of absolute equality of things and people begin to make itself known to you, then you will detect a presence in each stone and clod, in each tree and plant, in each animal and person you meet, locked in a prison dictated by its form, to be sure, but a presence pure and simple of the secret self, which has chosen the masquerade for its own purposes and is not truly locked away from consciousness of its real self, but even now is developing it as we brush at the veil that separates us from our heritage. Once a man senses the presence of the divine in all things, he is able to arrive at a sense of equality that makes him in some secret and inviolable corner of his being untouched by victory or defeat, pleasure or pain, position or prestige. He becomes so intent on doing the work of the secret self that he abandons almost altogether the uses of the ego and so achieves a kind of selflessness in his appearance to the world. Equality is a perfect psychic position, but is impossible to the ego, which seeks forever to be better than all the egos around it. And if it is not better, it is convinced it is worse, and so either becomes blown up and blind or wounded and fearful, and thus provides the worst of all psychic bases for dealing with life, love, and accomplishment. To be equal is to be unafraid, to know that there inhabits all others the same being that inhabits you, is to achieve a psychic confidence that enables you to place your life and hopes and energies in the hands of this being without a qualm, with absolute certainty that you will be guided to perform that work that you must do in the best of all possible ways, at the best of all possible times. The phantom material world. It is an established fact that our five senses perceive but the tiniest portion of the almost infinite spectrum of vibrations that prevails in the universe, that 1,000,000 times more remain untold about each thing than can possibly be perceived by sensual means. Whistles can be made which are imperceivable to the human ear, but are easily heard by certain animals. The frequency of vibration we know as light is strictly bounded as to the range that has an effect on the human eye. But nevertheless, we know there are variations in what people can see. Some are colorblind, others nearsighted, others farsighted. Some have an artist's vision. To others, materializations appear, as to Bernadette at Lourdes. In short, the materialist who prides himself on accepting nothing but the evidence of his senses is accepting the sketchiest of evidence. He actually prides himself on his blindness, accepting things as facts on the basis of knowing a mere 1/100000th of their total qualities. He would not dream of entering a business deal with such meager knowledge, but accepts the world and others and himself on such evidence, and rears like a reluctant stallion when it is suggested to him that he lives among phantoms. Focusing attention on the ego and the evidence of the senses is the veil that hides the secret self. The senses themselves are not the veil, only the impression they give that they are conveying to the observer the total aspect of things. Nor is ego inherently a veil, only the impression that it gives through completely dominating the consciousness that it is the actual self of the person. Hung up in his sensual world and totally immersed in the ego, a man has no chance to perceive the secret self. The clarion call sounds, but his ears are not attuned. With his tiny and incomplete knowledge, he keeps entering into things without perceiving their true nature and ultimate destiny, and therefore his path through life is marked mainly by suffering and defeat. Though occasionally the purposes of this ego will coincide with the ends of the divine, in which case he willingly falls victim to his own duplicity, convinced that his little machinations have moved the world. The end of his ego is certain still, for it is but flotsam adrift on a surging tide, and sooner or later destroys itself by pursuing its separate ends. Resignation and aspiration. To let go of ego is the thing to be done. To get outside of and free from the grip of the senses is the only path to discovery of the secret self. Many people are brought to their knees by life before they let go of self and achieve equality through resignation. Many of the most brilliantly recorded illuminations have happened in this manner. Out of the utmost defeat and degradation of the human soul have arisen its most inspirational moments. But it is doubtful if any human being would willingly choose such a path for an end that is vague to him in the first place. Mystics who have discovered the secret self through mental and spiritual concentration report that even they have experienced a dark night of the soul as the ego was surrendered. Evelyn Underhill chronicles many such transfigurations, and all were preceded by a period of deep spiritual and emotional depression, such as Christ had in the Garden of Gethsemane. It is no easy thing to surrender ego. It is a kind of death, but it must be done before life can be enlarged by the expanded consciousness that results from complete possession of the individual by the secret self. The quality above all things that is required is courage. You must push off. The jump must be taken. Literally, it is almost exactly as recorded by Dustin Smith, a free fall parachutist. The first time you go into a free fall is the weirdest. You have no idea what is going to happen. You are terrified on the first step. Then you look down, like God, and the ultimate is going away from the plane. In this, you're free and you're purely responsible for yourself. There is a real moment of truth when you reach for the cord. You come down absolutely elated. You've done something that in one way seems ridiculous, but in another way makes great sense. Now, it is not recommended that any seeker after truth adopt parachuting as a means to illumination, but there can be no doubt from Mr. Smith's observation that pushing off from the safety of an airplane into the unknown dangers of the sky is almost exactly like the spiritual step of pushing away from the ego and surrendering one's life to the unknown guidance of the secret self. They both require courage. They both exemplify a search. They both typify man's aspiration to pierce the veils that blind him. The country beyond. The end result of transfiguration, of illumination, is for the ego to be properly subordinated to the divine. But before the secret self can even appear to the aspiring soul, there must be a prior period of time in which the edge of the importance of the ego is gradually whittled down until it is no longer occupies the whole consciousness, until there is room within the awareness for light to enter, for the divine to be revealed. Some people are so immersed in the workings of the ego that they haven't the faintest idea what is meant by subordinating it to another principle. To them, the ego is the beginning and end, the sum of all existence, and according to how they gratify the surface self by power and position and victory, they feel they have achieved success in life. The truth is that the surest way to ensure against success in life, the success of arriving at a grasp of the meaning of existence, is to continually gratify the ego. What results then is a blindness by limitation, for the ego being small, cannot see beyond itself. Jesus, a great mystic and a master of spiritual knowledge, pronounced it to be more difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. This observation of his, of course, is largely parable. It is not strictly rich men Jesus referred to, for some rich men are most spiritual, but rather men who live to gratify the senses and their own ingrown vanity. These are the ones to whom expanded consciousness is unavailable. It is denied for no moral reason, but a purely scientific one. If one chooses to look through a crack in the wall, there is revealed a partial world. If one goes through the wall, the true aspect of the country beyond is revealed at last. Forsaking ego and uniting with the secret self makes this view possible to the aspiring soul. Expanding consciousness. Consciousness is the key to discovering the secret self. To become aware that consciousness is the same in all people is a big step on the road to illumination. Once you have become struck by the enormity of the situation, you will never again be the same. You will innately perceive that at work in the universe is not a multitude of aspiring and searching souls, but one individual only. And you are it, and it is all others. And so in a very real sense, you and your neighbor are one. Once the magnificent implications of this fact have come home to you, you will see that the secret of effective living is not the exerting of your individual will as you have always supposed it to be, but rather in growing to know and understand events and objects so that you can correctly perceive their true purpose and destiny. And you will not do that by observing the surface facts as recorded by the ego itself, but only by expanding your consciousness to the point where objects and events become a part of you, as they surely are in actuality, for both you and they are the secret self. To expand consciousness infinitely would be to grow into oneness with the one force, the one power, the one mind that truly exists. Perhaps this goal in this age and at this stage of evolution is impossible, but nevertheless, we can expand our present consciousness 1,000-fold, if not to include the universe, certainly to include our friends and neighbors and the events and circumstances that surround us. By a process of identification, we can come to know other things and other people and outside events even as we know ourselves. And possessed by this knowledge, we can act in the midst of all things in complete accord with their true nature and destiny. And so our actions take on a kind of omnipotence, our works, a kind of absolute effectiveness, so that we appear to be molding and changing the world about us, when in truth we're only acting in conformity with its real but unrevealed nature. Magic alchemy. It is not I, but a power greater than I, is the first acknowledgement we must make to the secret self. Once this is done, we have by a kind of surrender placed our fate where it should be, in the hands of something infinitely more informed and more capable. To forsake the urgings and promptings of the surface nature and ego is the first step. For as long as we are bound to this ineffective and tiny microcosm, we cannot be effective in our works or serene in our spiritual development. We must turn away from that which we have always considered self and embrace that which we have always considered other than self. And in that turning away and in that embracing lies our salvation. It is not I who doeth the works, stated Jesus, but the Father that dwelleth within me. And when his transfiguration was complete, I and the Father are one. The surface self will not surrender lightly. Its struggles and misguided urgings will be constant. Wise is the man, and extremely enlightened, who manages to control his ego at all times. To be human is to be subject to error, but to discover within the image of perfection and joy is to find a way out of the morass of physical sensation in which we find ourselves entrapped in life. Salvation for all of us is as near as ourselves, for there dwells within each of us a hallowed light, a hidden self that can relieve our sufferings and frustrations, no matter how painful or enduring. We have only to discover and embrace it, for it to become our true selves and to work its magic in our lives. End of chapter 2. All right, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, share this with your friend, leave me a comment, let me know you are here, and let's head over to chapter 3 and let's find out what is the greatest magic of all.